Welcome to the Peak Performance Podcast. I'm Brad Young, and this show exists for one reason: to go deeper than the surface level fitness content flooding your feed. Each episode is a focused, research backed, experience tested conversation about what it actually takes to perform at your highest level across training, recovery, mindset, and the science shaping how we understand the human body. No fluff, no shortcuts, just the real work and the thinking behind it, and the rise of precision recovery. Recovery has become the new frontier of peak performance. This episode breaks down sleep technology, HRV intelligence, micro recovery protocols, and my real world tests of what actually moves the needle. Recovery is the work. I want to start this episode with a reframe that I consider genuinely foundational, one that took me years to fully internalize, and that I think is the most important shift a serious performer can make in how they think about their training and lifestyle. Recovery is not the absence of training. It is not what happens when you stop doing the real work. Recovery is the process through which training stress is converted into adaptation. It is in the most literal physiological sense where the actual performance gains are made. Training is the stimulus. Recovery is the response. And you cannot have an adaptation without an adequate response. And this sounds simple, maybe even obvious, but the implications are profound, and most people don't actually live them. The performance culture that most serious athletes and high performers inhabit, the culture of more, harder, longer, creates an implicit hierarchy where training is the virtue and recovery is the compromise. People brag about how little sleep they got and still trained. They wear their fatigue like a badge. They feel guilty on rest days. And then they wonder why their progress has plateaued, why they feel perpetually beat up, why their performance in their actual key sessions is mediocre despite enormous training volume. The answer is almost always in the recovery column. They are training more than they are recovering from. In 2026, the science and the technology of recovery have evolved to a point where this is no longer a matter of opinion or intuition. It can be measured, quantified, and optimized with precision that simply wasn't available 10 years ago. Sleep stages can be tracked with meaningful accuracy. HRV can reveal the state of your autonomic nervous system in real time. Inflammatory markers can be monitored continuously. Neuromuscular readiness can be assessed in 30 seconds. The information is available. The question is whether you're using it and whether you're using it intelligently. That's what this episode is about. Sleep, the non negotiable foundation of recovery. If I could give every high performer on the planet one piece of advice about recovery, and only one, it would be this: protect your sleep with the same aggression and intentionality that you protect your training. Not sort of, not when it's convenient, ruthlessly. Because everything else in the recovery conversation, there's the supplements, the cold plunges, the massage guns, the fancy protocols, adds incremental value on top of a sleep foundation that, if it's adequate, does the vast majority of the physiological recovery work on its own. Without adequate sleep, everything else is patching holes in a sinking boat. The physiology of sleep based recovery is extraordinary, and I don't think most athletes appreciate how much is actually happening during those hours. Deep sleep, the slow wave stages, is where the majority of growth hormone is secreted. Growth hormone drives tissue repair, protein synthesis, fat metabolism, and immune function. Disrupted or insufficient deep sleep doesn't just make you feel tired the next day, it measurably impairs your ability to repair the micro damage from training, reducing the adaptation stimulus and leaving you with higher residual inflammation than you should be carrying. REM sleep, meanwhile, is essential for motor learning consolidation, the neurological process by which the movement skills practiced during training are encoded into long-term motor memory. If you're working on technical skills and you're chronically short on REM, you're leaving adaptation on the table every single night. The sleep technology landscape has evolved dramatically in the past few years, and I want to give you an honest assessment of where it stands. The best consumer-grade sleep trackers, the leading rings and wrist-worn devices, have reached a point where their sleep staging accuracy is genuinely useful for trend analysis, even if it's not yet at the precision of a clinical polysomnography study. What I use this data for? Is not absolute measurement, but relative tracking. Is my deep sleep trending up or down over a 2 week period? How does my REM percentage respond to alcohol, late eating, or evening training? These relative comparisons tracked consistently provide actionable information that the absolute numbers can't fully capture. Sleep architecture optimization, going beyond duration. Most recovery conversations focus on sleep duration. Are you getting 7 to 9 hours? That's important. But I've found that sleep architecture, the quality and composition of the sleep you get, is at least as important as the quantity. And it's an area where deliberate interventions can make a dramatic difference even when total sleep time is fixed. Understanding sleep architecture and how to optimize it is one of the highest leverage recovery skills available to serious performers. The first major lever is sleep timing and circadian anchoring. Your sleep architecture is profoundly influenced by where your sleep falls relative to your circadian rhythm. Going to sleep at the same time each night, even on weekends, allows your body to predict and optimize the hormonal cascade that governs sleep stage cycling. Variability in sleep timing, even by an hour or two, disrupts this optimization and measurably reduces the quality of deep and REM sleep you get within the same total sleep duration. I track my sleep consistency score as a separate metric from my sleep duration for exactly this reason, because a consistently timed 7 hour night often produces better quality sleep architecture than an erratic 8 hour night. Now, the second major lever is thermal optimization. Core body temperature needs to drop by approximately 1 to 2 degrees Celsius for sleep onset and for optimal sleep depth. Your sleeping environment plays a significant role in enabling this. A cool room, somewhere in the range of 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit for most people, actively facilitates the temperature drop that allows deeper sleep stages to emerge. Some of the most impactful sleep quality improvements I've seen people make have come not from supplements or protocols, but simply from cooling their bedroom down and keeping it there. It's an extraordinarily simple intervention with disproportionate impact, and most people have never tried it deliberately. HRV intelligence reading. Your autonomic nervous system. Heart rate variability has become one of the most widely discussed metrics in the performance and recovery space. And with that widespread discussion has come an enormous amount of confusion, misapplication, and oversimplification. I want to spend some serious time on HRV in this episode because when it's understood correctly and used appropriately, it is one of the most genuinely useful recovery metrics available to athletes and high performers. And when it's misunderstood, which is common, it leads to training decisions that range from useless to counterproductive. HRV is the variation in the time interval between consecutive heartbeats. The common misconception is that high HRV is always good and low HRV is always bad. The reality is more nuanced. HRV is a reflection of the balance between your sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight branch, and your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest branch. High HRV generally indicates parasympathetic dominance, which is associated with recovery readiness and the ability to tolerate and adapt to new stress. Low HRV generally indicates sympathetic dominance, which can signal unrecovered training stress, illness, psychological stress, or other physiological demands, but it can also, under specific conditions, reflect an appropriate acute sympathetic activation, such as before a competition, that is entirely healthy and appropriate. The most important principle in using HRV as a training guide is to track trends, not isolated data points. A single morning HRV reading tells you very little. A 2 week trend is your HRV moving up, holding steady, or declining. Tells you a great deal about the cumulative state of your recovery and your readiness to absorb new training stress. I use a rolling 7-day average of my morning HRV readings, measured in a consistent way at a consistent time each morning, and I compare each new reading against that rolling average rather than against an absolute number. When my morning HRV is at or above my rolling average, I have a green signal to pursue my planned training. When it's significantly below, I use a 10% threshold. I treat that as a flag for investigation, not an automatic rest day prescription, but a prompt to look at the full picture before deciding on training load. Micro recovery protocols finding the edges between sessions. One of the most underutilized recovery opportunities in most performers' lives is not the big block of sleep at night. It's the small windows between training, between work demands, and within a busy day where deliberate micro recovery practices can meaningfully influence the cumulative state of your nervous system, your inflammatory load, and your readiness for subsequent training. I call these micro recovery protocols, and they are an area where I've done extensive personal experimentation over the past few years. The science behind micro recovery is grounded in what researchers call ultradian rhythms, roughly 90-minute cycles of brain activity that alternate between focused, high performance states and natural low performance periods where the brain is signaling for rest. Most people in high demand environments override these rest signals with stimulants, willpower, and the cultural pressure to be constantly productive. The physiological consequence is an accumulation of low grade stress, elevated cortisol, sympathetic nervous system activation, and cognitive fatigue that compounds across the day and bleeds into both evening recovery and the quality of subsequent training sessions. Honoring these natural rest signals, even briefly, is not laziness. It's intelligent nervous system management. The specific micro recovery protocols I've tested and found most effective include physiological sigh breath work, 2 inhales through the nose, followed by a long exhale through the mouth, repeated for about 90 seconds, which research from Stanford has shown to be one of the fastest ways to activate the parasympathetic nervous system and reduce acute physiological stress. 10 to 20 minute non sleep deep rest protocols, a guided body scan, or yoga nidra practices that produce measurable reductions in cortisol and improvements in afternoon cognitive performance. And deliberate nature exposure during breaks, even a 10-minute walk in a natural environment, produces significantly greater parasympathetic activation than the same time spent on a phone or in a built environment. These are not complicated, but they are consistently practiced by the most recovery intelligent performers I know. Cold and heat exposure, separating signal from noise. I've been publicly skeptical of some of the more extreme claims in the cold and heat exposure space, particularly the framing of these practices as performance silver bullets. And I want to be clear about that skepticism while also being honest about what the evidence and my own experience actually show, because there is real signal here, buried under a lot of hype and imprecise application. The key is understanding what these modalities actually do at a mechanistic level so that you can use them in ways that serve your recovery and performance goals rather than working against them. Cold water immersion is genuinely effective for acute recovery from high intensity training, specifically for reducing delayed onset muscle soreness and perceived fatigue in the 24 to 48 hours following a hard session. The mechanism involves vasoconstriction that reduces local inflammation and tissue swelling, and a vagal nerve activation that produces parasympathetic nervous system engagement. For competitive athletes with back to back high intensity training days or competition blocks, this acute recovery benefit is well supported and practically significant. However, and this is the critically important caveat, regular cold immersion immediately following resistance training appears to blunt the anabolic signaling cascade that drives muscle adaptation. The very inflammatory response that cold is suppressing is part of the growth stimulus. Using cold immediately after resistance training is essentially trading long term adaptation for short term comfort and for a strength or hypertrophy focused athlete. That's a bad trade. Sauna use operates through completely different mechanisms and has a compelling evidence base for both recovery and cardiovascular health outcomes. Regular sauna exposure, 3 to 4 times per week in the 15 to 20-minute range at high temperatures, produces significant increases in growth hormone, activates heat shock proteins that support cellular repair, and appears to have meaningful cardiovascular conditioning effects independent of exercise. It also consistently improves sleep quality when used in the early evening, likely through the post sauna core temperature drop that facilitates sleep onset. I've been using sauna consistently for 2 years, and the sleep quality and recovery resilience improvements have been among the most consistent positive effects in my entire protocol stack. nutrition as a recovery tool, timing, composition, and the windows that matter. Recovery nutrition is an area where the science is quite clear at the principle level, but where the practical application is often done poorly, either overly complicated into a rigid protocol that creates stress and rigidity, or completely ignored in favor of a loose, just eat well approach that misses meaningful recovery optimization opportunities. I want to give you the practical principles that I've found most evidence supported and most practically implementable for serious performers who want to use nutrition deliberately as a recovery tool. The post training window, the period from immediately after training to roughly 4 hours post session, is the most important nutritional recovery window, and the priorities within it are clear. Protein synthesis is elevated in this window, which means providing adequate amino acid availability through high quality protein intake is important for maximizing the repair and adaptation stimulus. 25 to 40 grams of high quality protein in the first 1 to 2 hours post training is the guideline that the research most consistently supports for adults. Carbohydrate intake in this window serves a different purpose: glycogen replenishment, and its importance scales with the intensity and duration of the training session. After a high intensity glycolytic session, prioritizing carbohydrates alongside protein is well supported. After a low intensity aerobic session, the urgency of carbohydrate replenishment is much lower. Sleep nutrition is a dimension of recovery eating that I think is dramatically underappreciated. The foods you consume in the 2 to 3 hours before sleep have direct consequences for sleep architecture, particularly for growth hormone secretion and deep sleep depth. High glycemic carbohydrate intake close to bedtime produces insulin spikes that interfere with the somatotropin axis, the hormonal system that drives growth hormone release during deep sleep. Late night alcohol, which many people use as a relaxation tool, is one of the most reliably effective ways to suppress REM sleep and fragment sleep architecture. These are not minor inconveniences. They are direct impairments to the most important recovery process your body runs every night. And understanding them in these terms as performance tools, not just dietary choices, changes how you relate to the decisions you make in the hours before bed. What actually moves the needle? My real world tests. I want to be completely honest with you in this section because I think it's the section you're actually here for. I've tested an enormous number of recovery tools, protocols, and approaches over the past several years, some with rigorous self tracking, some more informally, all with genuine curiosity and an attempt at objective assessment. What I'm going to share with you is my personal hierarchy of what has moved the needle most meaningfully in my own recovery and performance, ranked by impact rather than novelty or marketing appeal. Number one, without any close competitor, is sleep consistency. Not duration, consistency. Going to bed and waking up at the same time every day, including weekends, has produced more measurable improvements in my HRV, my subjective recovery, my cognitive performance, and my training quality than any other single intervention I've tested. It's also the least exciting intervention, which is probably why it doesn't sell wearables or supplements. But the data is unambiguous. Circadian consistency is the most powerful recovery lever I've found. Number two is the removal of alcohol, even in social amounts, from my weekday routine. A single drink in the evening demonstrably suppresses my deep sleep and reduces my morning HRV the following day in ways that show up reliably in my tracking data. The performance cost of what most people consider moderate social drinking is substantially larger than most people want to believe, and my own data makes that cost impossible for me to ignore. Number three is structured breath work, specifically 10 minutes of deliberate parasympathetic activation breathing in the evening, which has been the single most effective tool I've found for down-regulating my nervous system after high stress days and improving my sleep onset time and sleep quality. Number four is the sauna protocol I described earlier. Number five, and I'll acknowledge some surprise at this rankings, is adequate dietary magnesium, either through food or supplementation, which appears to have a genuinely significant impact on sleep depth and muscle recovery in athletes who are commonly deficient. The interventions that didn't make this top 5 list, despite significant marketing investment from the companies selling them, include most compression recovery devices, most popular amino acid supplements beyond leucine adequate protein, and several of the recovery focused wearable accessories that claim benefits not supported by my own data or the independent research I've reviewed. The psychology of recovery, why belief and perception matter. There is a dimension of recovery that rarely gets discussed in the physiology focused conversations that dominate this space, and I want to bring it into the open because I think ignoring it leads to an incomplete picture. The psychology of recovery, specifically your beliefs about whether you are recovering adequately and your perception of fatigue and readiness, has a measurable impact on actual physiological outcomes independent of the objective metrics. This is not a reason to dismiss the metrics. It's a reason to pay attention to the full picture. Research has demonstrated what's been called the nocebo effect in sleep monitoring, the phenomenon where people who are shown inaccurate data indicating they slept poorly perform worse on cognitive tasks the following morning than their actual sleep quality would predict. In other words, believing you slept badly produces some of the performance consequences of sleeping badly, even when sleep was objectively adequate. This has direct implications for how we use sleep and recovery tracking tools. If your recovery score comes back low on a day when you subjectively feel ready and energized, defaulting to the data and treating yourself as unrecovered may produce worse outcomes than trusting your felt sense. Yeah. The tools are one input, they're not the final authority. The flip side of this is that deliberate recovery practices, even those where the mechanistic evidence is modest, may produce genuine benefits partly through the psychological reassurance they provide and the rituals of self care they represent. This is not a reason to dismiss the evidence base, it's a reason to recognize that the meaning and intentionality behind a recovery practice contributes to its effectiveness. Athletes who have clear, consistent recovery rituals, who approach their recovery with the same intentionality they bring to their training, tend to report better subjective recovery and show better adaptation patterns than athletes who treat recovery as incidental. The psychological component of recovery is real, it's measurable, and it deserves deliberate attention alongside the physiological protocols. Building a personalized recovery system. A framework. Let me give you a practical framework for building a personalized recovery system. Not a rigid protocol copied from someone else's approach, but a systematic method for identifying what your body specifically responds to and building a recovery practice around that individualized understanding. This is the approach I'd recommend to any serious performer who is ready to take their recovery as seriously as their training. The starting point is establishing your monitoring baseline. Before you introduce any new recovery interventions, spend 2 to 4 weeks tracking your current recovery state consistently. Morning, HRV, sleep quality via wearable, and a daily subjective recovery score. This baseline gives you a reference against which you can measure the impact of any subsequent interventions. Too many people skip this step and then can't tell whether the new protocol they're trying is actually doing anything because they have no baseline to compare against. The data is only useful in context. From that baseline, introduce changes one at a time, not 3 new protocols simultaneously, which is how most people approach recovery optimization when they get excited about it. Single variable testing is slower, but it's the only way to actually know what's working. Commit to a new intervention for a minimum of 3 weeks before evaluating its impact on your tracking metrics. Some interventions show effects quickly. Others require a longer adaptation window before the benefit shows up in the data. 3 weeks gives you enough of a trend to draw a tentative conclusion. If the intervention is producing measurable positive movement in your tracking metrics and positive subjective experience, integrate it and make it a permanent part of your stack. If it's neutral or negative, discard it with confidence. This systematic approach, baseline, single variable introduction, adequate trial period, data-informed evaluation, is how you build a recovery system that is genuinely optimized for your individual physiology rather than borrowed from someone else's protocol. Recovery for cognitive performance, the overlooked dimension. I want to dedicate a section to something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in athletic recovery conversations: the recovery of cognitive performance. For most of the high performers I work with and talk to, their athletic performance is inextricably linked to their cognitive performance, their ability to make good decisions under fatigue, to maintain tactical awareness, to learn and implement new skills, to manage competitive pressure. All of these are cognitive functions, and all of them are impaired by inadequate recovery in ways that are measurable and consequential. The neuroscience of cognitive recovery is fascinating and practically important. The glymphatic system, the brain's waste clearance mechanism, operates almost exclusively during sleep, specifically during deep sleep. During this process, cerebrospinal fluid flows through the spaces around neurons, clearing metabolic waste products, including beta amyloid and tau proteins, the same proteins whose accumulation is associated with neurodegenerative disease. Chronic sleep deprivation impairs glymphatic function, allowing these metabolic byproducts to accumulate. The practical consequence in the short term is not neurodegeneration, but it is measurably impaired processing speed, working memory, and decision making quality. For a competitive athlete whose performance depends on split second decisions and tactical intelligence, these cognitive impairments are not irrelevant side effects. They are direct performance costs. The interventions that most reliably support cognitive recovery overlap significantly with the physical recovery protocols I've discussed. Adequate and well architected sleep is the primary driver of glymphatic clearance and cognitive restoration. Deliberate psychological downregulation, reducing cognitive demand, minimizing decision load, avoiding emotionally activating content in the evening, gives your prefrontal cortex the recovery period it needs to restore executive function. And regular aerobic exercise, which promotes BDNF, brain derived neurotrophic factor, supports the neuroplasticity that underlies learning, adaptation, and cognitive resilience. Taking care of your brain's recovery is taking care of your performance capacity in its most comprehensive sense. When recovery is not enough, recognizing overreaching and overtraining. I want to close the technical content of this episode with something critically important: the recognition and management of overreaching and overtraining syndrome. Because no recovery conversation is complete without addressing what happens when the gap between training stress and recovery capacity becomes too large for too long. This is not a rare phenomenon confined to elite professional athletes. I see markers of overreaching regularly in serious recreational athletes and high performing adults who are managing demanding training loads alongside demanding life loads without adequate recovery infrastructure. Functional overreaching is the normal managed state of training fatigue that occurs during high load training blocks, a temporary performance decrement that resolves with adequate taper and recovery and leaves the athlete in a supercompensated state above their previous baseline. This is intentional. This is how progressive training works. The problem begins with non-functional overreaching, or a deeper fatigue state where performance decrements persist beyond what a week or two of reduced training load resolves. Left unaddressed, non-functional overreaching can progress to overtraining syndrome, a clinical condition involving hormonal dysregulation, immune suppression, mood disturbances, and performance decrements that can take months to fully resolve. I've been in this territory once in my training life, and it is a deeply unpleasant experience that I would work very hard to help anyone avoid. The early warning signs of non-functional overreaching are worth knowing by heart: persistent HRV depression over 2 or more weeks despite adequate sleep, elevated resting heart rate without explanation, increased perceived effort at submaximal training intensities, degraded mood, motivation, and emotional resilience, disrupted sleep despite fatigue, increased injury incidence and slow healing, persistent muscle soreness that doesn't resolve with typical recovery windows. If you are experiencing 3 or more of these symptoms concurrently, the appropriate response is not another recovery protocol. It is a significant reduction in training load, potentially complete rest for 1 to 2 weeks, and a serious evaluation of whether your recovery infrastructure is adequate for the training load you've been carrying. More training is not the solution, it is the problem. The solution is honoring the recovery side of the equation with the same seriousness you brought to the training side. The future of recovery, where the science and technology are heading. I want to spend a few minutes looking ahead because I think the next 5 years in the precision recovery space are going to be genuinely transformative. And having a map of where this is heading allows you to engage with emerging tools from a position of informed evaluation rather than reactive adoption. The trends I'm watching most closely represent a convergence of biological measurement, artificial intelligence, and personalized intervention that is going to make the current generation of recovery tools look remarkably primitive. The most significant near term development is the continued miniaturization and accuracy improvement of continuous physiological monitoring. We're moving rapidly toward a world where multiple biomarkers, not just heart rate and HRV, but glucose, lactate, cortisol, and eventually inflammatory cytokines, can be monitored continuously from wearable sensors that are comfortable, accurate, and practically invisible. When those data streams are synthesized by AI systems with sufficient training data, the result will be a real time recovery intelligence layer that can tell you, with precision, exactly how recovered you are at the cellular and hormonal levels. Not just at the autonomic nervous system level. That is a fundamentally different quality of information than anything currently available outside of elite sports science facilities. And it will be wearable and consumer accessible within the next 5 years. And the other frontier I find compelling is individualized recovery prescription, the move away from population average recovery guidelines toward AI generated recovery protocols that are specifically calibrated to your individual physiology, your training history, your current load, and your specific recovery response patterns. The future is not athletes should sleep 8 hours. The future is your specific physiology based on your data requires 7 hours and 40 minutes with specific sleep stage targets. And here are the 3 personalized interventions that most reliably achieve those targets in your individual case. That level of precision is coming. And for anyone who is serious about performance, understanding that it's coming and positioning yourself to engage with it intelligently when it arrives is part of what it means to be a truly informed, adaptive performer in this era. That brings us to the close of the episode and the close of this 4 episode collection. I want to spend a moment reflecting on the through line that connects all 4 of these conversations because I think it's important and I don't want it to get lost in the technical depth we've covered across each topic, whether we're talking about AI enhanced training, metabolic flexibility, psychological staying power, or precision recovery. The fundamental principle underneath all of it is the same. High performance over the long term is a function of intelligent investment in the right inputs, measured honestly against the right outputs, refined continuously based on what the data actually shows rather than what we want it to show or what we wish were true. It requires intellectual honesty. It requires the willingness to be wrong and to update. It requires patience because most of the adaptations that matter most take months and years to manifest, not days and weeks. And it requires commitment, not the motivational, feeling driven kind, but the identity level, non negotiable kind that doesn't ask permission from your mood or your schedule. That is the work. It is not glamorous in the day to day, it is extraordinary in the long run. And if you're here listening to this, I believe you already know that because the kind of person who seeks out this level of depth and detail about training and recovery is exactly the kind of person who is building something that matters to them over time. Thank you for trusting me with that time. Thank you for bringing this kind of seriousness to your own performance. I'll be back with more on the next episode of the Peak Performance Podcast. Until then, keep doing the work. It compounds. I promise you it compounds.